more. In addition to organizing, Kelsey uses her online platform to lead with vulnerability in facilitating discussions around fat liberation, mental health, anti-Black racism, and more. And we also have Ana Laura. She, her, ella, was raised in Tijuana and San Diego and grew up in a working class and immigrant household. As a fat queer, she is committed to, quote, practicing futures together, practicing justice together, and living into new stories. And that's a quote from Adrienne Marie Brown. So thank you to both of you for being here. We're so excited to talk to you and have this discussion. I'd really like to kick this off by asking you both to introduce us to what is We All We Got SD? What does your work look like right now? And what do you hope to accomplish in the future? Oh, either one of you.
Well, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the political education group who put this together, Asian Solidarity Collective in general. Super honored and blessed to be joining you on this conversation today. Kelsey, maybe both of us can take a stab at this too. But We All We Got, a little bit about it. It was started by badass organizers, Candy being one of them, Christina Griffin and Kelsey as well. With the intention of showing up for community. It's this understanding with mutual aid. It's not a neutral project. It's a political project, understanding that the systems that are currently in place are not gonna deliver for those communities that are impacted. And we're talking about BIPOC folks, so Black, Indigenous, people of color. We're talking about queer folks. We're talking about folks with disabilities. Like, the system is not gonna deliver for them. So it was very intentional with We All We Got, of like, how do we show up for those communities and address food insecurity?
Right. Yeah, so like Ana Laura said, like, We All We Got was in response to some of the BS that COVID brought up, but really is also operating and imagining a world beyond this pandemic, and is about how can we not just address the issues, but believe that we can create a community that will like reimagine what these systems have to look like, right? I think that prior to this pandemic, a lot of folks maybe didn't realize like the power and strength that we had in our communities to show up in the ways that the government clearly has failed forever, and is continuing to fail. And I think that the beautiful thing with We All We Got is it's showing, and not just We All We Got, but like the mutual aids that are showing up now, it's really demonstrating that we have so much power in community to build, and we can do things differently than the systems that have come before us, right? We don't have to be carceral. We don't have to operate under a lens of white supremacy that like assesses worthiness based off of these like intangible things that you have no control over. And so it's really about just imagining a new world.
Yeah, and then just adding to that is like being intentional with our mutual aid group. It's like being unapologetic in the sense of like acknowledging white supremacy, acknowledging capitalism, hetero-cis patriarchy, imperialism, colonialism, all of these systems that have contributed to institutionalized forms of oppression. And on our end is like uplifting that, and also uplifting, similar to what Kelsey said, that even before COVID, all these systems have been manifesting, right? And now with COVID, they've just been exacerbated to a level that is just fucking ridiculous. And yes, I'm cussing, I'm an Aries sign, y'all. But also like being intentional of that and uplifting the importance of mutual aid in the sense of like acknowledging people where they're at, what are their needs, and also like acknowledging people's own self-determination to kind of like tell us what are the things that they need. So with We All We Got, shout out to Baddie, who I see is on this call. But we've basically transformed to like, yes, we are delivering, we are connecting people to get food, but at the same time, we're also doing our best to like expand. So Kari was one of the folks who created started the weekly food distribution that we have at City Heights. And now we're doing it twice a week for the past month. So shout out to Kari for that, making that happen. And on our end is really like meeting people where they're at. And our principles also reflect like we do not work with people who enact state violence. So that's one thing that's one of our principles of like, you know, acknowledging that police, ICE, Border Patrol, all these folks enact systems of oppression and they perpetuate violence for BIPOC communities. So I'm really appreciative to be in collective with folks who these are principles and this is how we're showing up.
Right. And something too, I pulled up like the principles because I was like, I'm trying to remember like the language that we came up with, but also like you said, being very intentional in naming that these system oppressions are real, because some of the things that people were demonstrating as we were building this was very much a policing mindset. And that is something that we are actively trying to move away from. And so being very intentional in naming that we are not just like acknowledging these systems in here, but like we're actually like working to dismantle these systems as we're showing up in solidarity. And I think that's a really crucial piece of this work that I'm really grateful that this team has been very intentional in lifting up and moving with.
Yeah. And I guess how does our work look like right now? Obviously, I remember being on the computer on like the Trello board with Candy like the week of like March 14th, just like, you know, getting set up. It's just a few folks of us and Baddie and Kelsey and all of us. And now we have like a full-fledged team of volunteers, and I see many of them are also on here. But we have folks who show up in terms of dispatching, connecting with people who are putting in requests, connecting with volunteers who are like, I want to show up and deliver for folks who are unable to go to the store. And then I think it's also shifted where we're seeing a greater need. And aside from food insecurity, we're also seeing like housing insecurity. So the demand is there in terms of like just the amount of need given the impact of COVID-19 and before that, right, on our communities. So if anything, I think we're just seeing greater need on our end and how expansive it's looking, and everything from like, yes, food, but like now it's housing, it's clothing, it's computers for, you know, their kids going to school. If the need is greater now, and also like being sustainable as well when it comes to funds as well. So if y'all want to donate to someone this payday, All We Got is one of them.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for, you know, naming not just all of the ways that all these needs are interconnected, right? But the way that these systems are really upholding the systems of oppression and finding ways to work outside of that. Just want to appreciate both of you and all of the All We Got folks for everything that you're doing. And now we're going to really dig into transformative justice. So this is such a big and beautiful topic. We're, I think, blessed right now to have transformative justice and defunding the police and abolition really entering mainstream consciousness in a big way. So we have some prepared questions that we're going to go over with our panelists, but if there's anything that you want to ask, feel free to drop those in the chat. We'll have some time at the end of today's session to really dig into some audience questions. So feel free to just type those in and we will get to them at the end. So let's kick this off with the big important question for you all. What is transformative justice? Like, what is your definition of this? It's really, it's big and it's layered, but let's just start there.
Yeah, that's a really big umbrella. And, you know, I want to name and acknowledge and express gratitude to people like Candy and Blair and other folks we got for really being intentional in helping us like move through this work with that lens. And one of the things that we've been doing as a core is like reading Beyond Survival and like really kind of digging into this work. And so for me, the transformative justice and how it shows up for me is like, what does it look like to address harm and also imagine a world in which we respond to it differently and we actively address the roots of that harm. And so that looks like in interpersonal relationships and larger conversations, like when we're talking about abolishing the police and defunding the police, right? And imagining what could happen in place of that, right? What looks like when we trust community to be able to be what we need it to be. And, you know, I see that in the work that we're doing with We Got, and just the way in which We Got has all these sibling orgs that are doing this work as well. It's really about like tapping into the collective imagination to say that this shit isn't working for us, but something else could. And so I guess that's like my really simple definition.
Yeah, thank you, Kelsey, for that. Definitely want to uplift WAWG crew from the very beginning, very intentional of grounding us in transformative justice. And we actually have like a weekly book club where we talk about beyond survival. Because it's one of those things where it's like you could talk about transformative justice, and I know transformative justice is like is very popular right now. But for us, it's also acknowledging that transformative justice work has been done by primarily, Black women, women of color, queer folks, and it's hard work. So kind of what Kelsey says, it's like this framework of like, we need alternatives because the current system is failing us in addressing harm, right? So we need an alternative where we are able to address harm, where we're not replicating harm, and we're able to do that. And in our conversations, I've just been so grateful in the sense of like acknowledging that transformative justice, like we can't romanticize it. It's not like a very like simple, there's closure. No, it's a messy as fuck process, and it's contradictory. It's all these feelings. So on my end, like the conversation that we've had with WAWG, we've uplifted all that in terms of like, yes, the need to have an alternative, but also acknowledging like it's one of those muscles like Mia Mingus and Mimi Kim and Maren Kaba have shared, like it's one of those muscles that we need to practice on an individual level every day. Like, are we able to address conflict at the smallest level, right? Before it gets escalated. So that's one of the things that I've appreciated in our conversation of like being intentional and practicing it like on a daily level. But also like acknowledging that it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be straightforward. Like it takes community. And that's one of the things that I've also appreciated with WAWG, because we stress relationship building and how important it is to like build those relationships for us to handle when shit hits the fan.
Right. And thank you so much for naming that it is like, it's a beautiful vision and a messy process. It's so messy, right? But let's also name, I would love to know, like, what are some of the challenges that you've observed or experienced with trying to live a transformative justice life?
I think like Ana Laura said, like it's messy, and like honestly, shit is shitty sometimes, right? Like I think dealing with the fact that like harm happens, and a lot of times it'll happen in ways that is complicated, right? So it's not just this like cut and dry situation. And I think TJ offers a really great framework of like acknowledging that there are so many different contributing factors, but that doesn't take away from the human reaction of like fuck you, like, and I think like acknowledging, and sorry I cuss a lot, but acknowledging like the fact that those things are going to come up, and there's still possibility in moving in a way that is not carceral. And I think one of the things that I'm really intrigued by and still learning is this idea of like when we talk about pod mapping, and there's the circle of like surrounding those who have been harmed, but also the circle in the pod of like surrounding those who have been the harmer, right? And what does it look like to have these accountability circles and accountability pods, and it's not necessarily the same people. And so looking at like who is able to kind of do the work of holding people accountable, and it's not always the person who's been directly impacted, right? So I think learning that has been really helpful in like addressing that challenge of the human piece of like, I'm too close to the situation at this moment in time to initiate that like process. But that doesn't mean it's not possible. And so I think that is a key. And also like, there isn't necessarily like, it's something that is, though it's not a new concept, it's something that is like very new in each iteration of how we enact it. And so sometimes there's just messiness of like where to start and like how to start dealing with it. And I think like even acknowledging that something has to be done is like just a really good step. But yeah, the challenge is that it's messy and human and all of that.
Yes, yes to all of that, to what Kelsey just said. I think this is one of the conversations that we've had too, in the sense of like, I think this is where like I mean like, let's not romanticize transformative justice, because it's so easy to be like, oh, transformative justice means XYZ, but we can't ignore the human aspect. Like we've talked about, like as individuals, I navigate feelings of bitterness, still feelings of resentment, feelings of anger, before I even I'm at a place to you know, if I was harmed, to kind of like give space to that person, right? And I think it's one of those things where like being okay with our human feelings before we get to that point, and responding in a way that's, we're not replicating carceral, punitive, cultural things. And it's one of the challenges, in the sense like all of us grow up with that cultural norm of like punitive, like this punitive culture. So that's like another challenge too, because that's something that all of us, like myself, I'm working through, in terms of responding in a way that it is not replicating that carceral mindset, but we're responding in a way where like these are other healthy alternatives to dealing with conflict, and being okay with that. Because at the end of the day, like we live in a fucked up system. So, you know, all of us, to some extent, we are we I don't want to say this, but all of our community, like all of us, we're all fucked up, right? In the sense like we have been ingrained with these isms. So I know on my end, I'm navigating isms that I also like been grow up with. So on my end is also thinking what Mia Minga says, is like really analyzing my relationship to myself. Is it toxic? And also analyzing in the sense of like, how am I showing up, building community with folks, and addressing like these issues and everything like that. So I feel like the challenges are very multifold in that kind of way, because it really starts with the self-reflection as well, and how we're showing up.
Yeah. And I think like to add on to that, in acknowledging the human piece, but boiling down to the idea of believing in the possibility of people getting better, right? And like that no one is like trash and beyond being reached. And that's like addressing the carceral idea of like there are things that you can do that like warrant you being thrown away. And then the idea of relationship to self, like when we do that, we're also saying that we're willing to throw ourselves away, right? That there are parts of us that like warrant our disposal. And I think so in addressing the challenge of all those things is really practicing like Ana Laura said, like radical grace with myself. And if I can see that in myself, like how can, even if I can't do that, like how can I imagine that like there is a way in which like we can address this and this person could, or these systems could be better, right? And so that's something that I've been working on, especially like, you know, new things pop up every day and I have to just breathe and like hold space.
Yeah, and that's something that before the pandemic, I was excited because I've been doing a lot of like reading on transformative justice and working on it. So I was really blessed to attend workshops and lectures with Mia Minguez and Maren Kaba. And that's one thing that resonated with myself, in the sense of like, do you have a toxic relationship with yourself? And I was like, oh shit, I feel dragged. But thinking about like transformative justice is like being okay with yourself. Like we're all gonna mess up. So like acknowledging that's going to happen, like expecting that, and are we prepared to address the harm that we are doing, that our loved ones are doing, that our friends are doing, and do we have that muscle memory of like calling people in, right? Do we have that energy? Are people, and the people on the other end, are they at the place where they're able to also recognize their harm, right? Because one of the things that folks in TJ, like the OG folks, stress is like, yes, accountability is important, but also like self-accountability is even more important. And for us to do true transformative justice work, like folks have to take accountability for their own stuff as well. Like, because otherwise, like the work, the onus falls on people who have been harmed, right? So it's we have to come to this work acknowledging that everyone commits harm, we commit harm, and we have to be prepared for when that happens.
That's so true. The work, it involves honesty and growth and vulnerability and care. There's just so much wrapped up into this concept of, you know, allowing ourselves the grace and forgiveness to mess up sometimes, and acknowledge that it's going to happen. And how do we move forward from there? How do we make sure that we stop it from happening again? To the best of our ability. I love that you both have been talking about how important taking care of yourself and giving yourself grace is. Do you have any other, from your perspective, small steps that we can take as individuals to start incorporating more of this transformative justice framework into the way that we live our lives?
Yeah, I mean, one of the practical things that we talked about, because like one of the things that we've talked about is things that, you know, folks who've been doing this work from Transformative Justice have mentioned, right? Like, do we know our own values? Like, and I challenge every one of you, like, this is something that Kaba and Mingus have also shared, like, are we having conversations with ourselves? Like, these are my values, and am I carrying myself aligned with my values? Are we having conversations with your family and friends? Like, these are my values, right? Because that's one way we're preparing to deal with conflict. We're laying the groundwork for dealing with harm, right? In that kind of way. So I think that's one of the practical things that all of us can do. And I challenge all of us to like go back and maybe like what I did, I nerded out, and I did one of those like big post-it notes, and I wrote like, these are my values, right? And that's something that I have to look at every day, because even today with work, I was like, someone just approached me very rude, and I was about to, and I was like, no, Ana Laura, that's not aligned with your values. Let's take a chill pill, right? But I experienced that very human feeling, right? And on my end, like, me having that conversation with myself and writing down like, these are my values and this is how I want to carry myself, is very intentional, because I'm practicing the world that I want to live in, not tomorrow, but today, right now. And it's very difficult. So I definitely challenge folks to definitely think through like, what are your values and are you living them on a day-to-day basis? I think that's one of the practical levels, one of the practical skills that we can do.
Yeah. Oh, I love the idea of talking through values. And for me, so I co-host another space with one of my good friends, and one of the community agreements that we talk about is offer grace and deny shame. And the way that we frame it is like, shame is a tool of white supremacy, and it serves to lock us in, and it keeps us in silos and isolation. It tells us like that we're not good enough, we're never going to be good enough, right? And grace is something that unlocks us into moving in love, and like moving in learning from what you've done. And so I think that is a practice that and we talk about internally and externally, right? So offering grace and denying shame to myself, offering grace and denying shame to others, in terms of those are some of my core values. And also like, what does it look like to really honestly move with curiosity and like evaluate like what could be happening here, right? Like beyond like, what am I seeing? Like what also could be happening here? What also could be at play? What am I bringing to a scenario? And that is something that is hard. It takes work. I don't always get it right. I think like reflection is really important to me. Really sitting in things. And really like, I'm a Virgo, so I'm already always tinkering and thinking through stuff. But really sitting in the what is, what could be, and like not being afraid to like literally admit when I'm wrong. And practicing that muscle of apologizing and owning, without the expectation of someone doing anything with it, right? Like, I think that is my piece, right? Like I can imagine a world in which we are together, but also really being mindful of like the ways in which it can be emotionally manipulative to like perform being a good person and like versus like actually existing in what am I doing that aligns with my values and like being human. I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, no, I feel all that we just said, Kelsey, because I think that's also one of the other practical skills that we've talked about in our group of like, how do we practice transformative justice on a day-to-day basis? In addition to that is like, do we know how to apologize, right? An apology is not like, oh, I'm sorry you felt that way. It's like, no, I'm sorry I did this, right? And one of the things that resonated in one of the training that I attended with me and Mingus was like, usually when we apologize for something, we have a practice to be like, oh, no worries. But one thing that me and Mingus challenged people is like, no, just accept the apology. You don't even have to say no worries. Just like, thank you, right? So even little things like that, like I think all of us are like we are conditioned to kind of like avoid conflict or avoid apologies. So like another thing is also like owning the apology, welcoming the apology. Like if anything, it's like it's a sign of trust. It's a sign of acknowledging like, hey, like I could have done better. So I found that really interesting how Mia Minga's challenge is to be like, no, just own it. Don't be like, no worries, it's okay. Just be like, thank you for apologizing. So that's also another thing that I'm also interested to like further continue to do in terms of like practicing that muscle. Because one thing that resonates, like if we can't handle conflict, like, and this is something that Mia Minga says, as you can tell, I'm a huge nerd and fan of her. But one thing that she says, it's like if we can't handle conflict with like the dishes with our roommate, we're not going to be able to handle like the like bigger harm, bigger conflict. So like really being okay with conflict as being generative, conflict as welcoming like us to do better with ourselves, us to do better with each other, and like welcoming that in and not being conflict avoidant.
Yeah, ooh, that number one dragged me, the no worries thing, because that is something I'm working on moving away from, but it's still hard. I love the phrase of conflict is generative, and like also conflict as an opportunity, like you said, to like practice these things, especially like when it's on a smaller level, in the relationships where you're like less likely to be thrown away. Like how do we like move through that? And like lean into it versus like avoid it, because when you're avoidant of conflict, it never is avoiding conflict. It's just prolonging this weird BS liminal space where the conflict is there and we're just not naming it. And so yeah, I really appreciate that language.
Mm-hmm. And again, this is not to romanticize things. It's so easy for us to be like, oh, these are skills that we've talked about. But like, again, we can't ignore the human aspect and the fact that all of us have been raised in a very punitive culture in the society, right? So it's also like acknowledging that some things are non-negotiable. So that's something part of transformative justice, like being okay with some relationships will not be repaired, that harm will not be repaired, and being okay with having no closure. And that's something that Candy and all of us, we talked about on our last call. Like things are not going to be linear, they're going to be messy, and we're going to have to be okay with like, given our values and where we stand, some things are non-negotiable and some relationships will not be able to be repaired, both because like the harm doer maybe is not able to acknowledge accountability, and also on our end as people who have been harmed, like we're not ready to come to this place of holding space for our harm doer, right?
Yeah, I think how that is living in me literally as I'm navigating a system of harm that I'm moving through, it is acknowledging that like some relationships can't be repaired, all these other things, but that doesn't mean I have to add to the carceral process. And like that is where I'm living in, right? And I don't necessarily want to go back, but I also don't need to operate outside of my values and adding on to this white supremacist bullshit. But that's not the same thing as like accountability and like naming harm. Like naming harm is not violence. Violence is violence. And so that's what I've been holding on to. The comments are blowing up. I'm excited to.
We've got so many great questions. I'm really excited for you to dig into some of these. I'm actually, yeah, there's just so many. Let's get into how transformative justice as a practice and as a framework is tied to what you all are doing with We All We Got.
Mm-hmm. I just want to uplift what Kelsey said in the beginning, like mutual aid work, we are recognizing, yes, there are systems in place that are not working for us. We're never meant to work for us. And similarly with transformative justice, it's the same thing. The current systems in place in addressing harm are doing the opposite. They're creating more harm for, specifically, we're talking about Black, Indigenous, people of color, working class, queer folks, people with disabilities, etc. So both mutual aid and transformative justice, and like in the work that we do with We All We Got, like they're both the same in a sense, like we deeply believe another world is possible. And I think at the crux of them, it's that, right? And how are we doing that?
Yeah, copy and paste. I think like very much that like we are in our process, specifically with the mutual aid work of creating a new world. How are we also like in the here and now honoring where people are, practicing new methods of engaging when conflict has arisen, you know, because that's something too. How are we honoring like a big thing that we talk about is like self-determination, right? So not recreating the harm that is paternalism in the nonprofit industrial complex, in which we don't believe that people have the agency to name for themselves what they need. And that's TJ work as well, right? Like, because we are actively involving people in the process of navigating harm versus doing for folks, which is violent. When we say that people are not sentient beings who are aware of like the experiences that they're holding. And so I think that is rooted in that as well.
Yes, to all of that, Kelsey. And I think just maybe some examples that we've seen in our We All We Got work. I remember like week 2 with Baddie navigating someone who was a volunteer who I think we forgot to like, I didn't pay them or reimburse them like immediately. And they called me and they threatened to call the cops. And on my end, I was angry and I was upset and I was frustrated that this white lady from North County was like showing up in this kind of way and replicating violence. And on my end, I literally had to take several deep breaths, like connected with Baddie. And I was able to address it like, yo, we're doing this work and these are our principles. And if you're not able to show up in that kind of way, go help the local food bank. Because like on our end, we are operating with these principles and they're non-negotiable. So in that kind of way, like I didn't have the capacity to school Shelly, and I think that was her name. Just kidding, it wasn't her name, just kidding. But like in that kind of moment, I had to practice like being in a space of like, how am I going to navigate this without replicating whatever I'm replicating. And then recently, another previous example at one of our food banks, like just having one particular individual show up in a way that is very like misogynistic and harassing. So on our end, like we've had conversations with the food distribution group, and Baddie, like feel free to jump in too, I see you. But we've had conversations where I've just been so continually like surprised and like blessed to see how folks are showing up in this very like TJ way, in a sense of like, no, like we can't just be like, fuck you, even though we want to, but we're able to meet him where he's at. We're like, you know what, we want to make sure that you get food, but we need you to show up in a certain kind of way. Or in thinking about different alternatives of how they show up for them to get their needs met. And I saw that Baddie went on their video, I'm not too sure if they want to chime in too, on how we practice transformative justice in our food distribution or in the work that we do.
No, I just, that's 100% what I would say. So I don't want to take up too much time, but just want to uplift that definitely every step of the way, we're trying to keep TJ work in mind, even though it's really not like the natural thing to do, because you want to be reactive and protective. But thanks for summing that up.
Yeah, thank you, Baddie. And you never take up Hella's space.
Never.
You're part of it.
So now we're going to move on to our audience questions, and there's so many amazing ones. Thank you all for being so inquisitive and curious. I'm going to kick it off to Jasmine.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Jasmine Bayesa. I'm proud to be part of the ASC Political Ed Committee. I will be moderating our Q&A with our amazing panelists for about 10 to 15 minutes before we move into our closing activity. You all asked amazing questions, and unfortunately, we're not going to be able to address all of them with the panelists, but Candy and I have compiled all of the questions already, and we'll be sending them all out to our attendees to allow us to kind of crowdsource and share ideas and thoughts. And so I'm going to try to be strategic about the ones that I pick in the order. So we had a really great question from Ana that says, How do you call people in as opposed to calling them out? And it's for either of you.
I think for me, I try to think through like, what is the intention of this interaction, right? And calling out, as I've seen it and as I've practiced it, sometimes it's just like, I'm just angry and I want to get this out here, right? And like, that's the purpose. Like, and sometimes like, that's the human, and I've done it and I will most likely do it again, right? Like, but what I am trying to shift into doing is like, okay, do I want to see a change, right? Am I the person who I think can like have this conversation and bring this to their attention? And if the answer is no, is there someone I can bring this to their attention to do this work too, right? But I think calling in is like shifting focus in, where do I want to see this go? Do I see this being a fruitful conversation or interaction? And like, am I out here practicing shame? Am I using that? Because I think shame is a completely ineffective tool as a modality to get people to change, right? I have a social service background, and so like we talk about the stages of change and that model, and like, at nowhere in those stages do I think shame will push people to it. It pushes like superficial change, right? Which is why you see call outs and then you see celebrities do these like fake ass apologies and then they move away from it. Like, and I think that's where I try to sit in.
I love that. Thank you. That actually kind of connects to another question we got from Alex. And so I wanted to ask you, and it's open to both of you, obviously, but they asked, do you believe that then there are limits to transformative justice or times when other strategies or frameworks of justice should be used? And how do you navigate that? And the example that they provided is having anxiety and uncertainty around transformative justice when it comes to situations involving sexual violence or deliberate abuse.
And a lot of you take that.
Sorry, that was like an intense question too. Hi, Anna. Hi, Kelsey. I love y'all. But it's just something that I think about transformative justice too, because like sometimes, like obviously, most situations are good, but like there are situations that are tougher to navigate, I guess.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question because it's really recognizing that harm, like transgressions can be as small as like, maybe I said something fucked up, versus like it's a spectrum, right? Transgression is like massive, right? And it's one of those things where I've just heard like, where it's like, some people have said, oh, transformative justice doesn't work because XYZ. But one of the things that I've seen like OG TJ heads like challenge is like, well, it didn't work because folks are not really like learning up and reading up on TJ and how that works. So it's hard for me to address this question, Alex, and I appreciate it just because like we're talking about transgressions can be from like small to hella massive. But I feel like honestly, at the end of the day, like transformative justice really depends on the consent of the person who was harmed and the person who committed the harm. And that's like one of the key elements of it. Is like, is a person who did the harm willing to come to the table and acknowledge I did fuck up? And also too, like, is a person who was harmed, like, do they consent to engaging these folks in that conversation as well? And if they don't, do other community members, are they able to also process through that accountability, right? But I deeply believe that TJ definitely can work. It just really just depends on those two things.
Right. I went to a workshop about like restorative practices in general, and they talked a lot about like, you cannot force people into accountability. When you start to force people into a process, it's carceral. And so like, I think Alex, like you bring up like a really good point and something that I wrestle with. Where I situate it for me is, even in the spaces that like TJ may be hard to work, we know that carceral systems don't work, right? And so I think that is where I situate myself with, like, we know that carceral systems do nothing to address the root cause of things. It's just putting someone on timeout and saying that whatever the arbitrary number of days or years that they've been on timeout, like is enough, right? So it also doesn't seek justice for those who have been harmed, right? And so imagining a world in which we lean more on transformative justice, as we like maneuver, how do we get people engaged in this process? Like Ana Laura said, like, how are we teaching people how to do these in small ways, so that way when the big things come, we can also do this work. So I think that, you know, but it's difficult. That's the messy, that's the whole thing. But I do know for a fact that it has worked. And this has been a process that people have been able to do. And as I like grow in my studies and being surrounded by amazing people who have been versed in this, like, it's my hope that we as a community can kind of learn together what this could look like. And I think it's a case by case basis.
Definitely.
Can I give an example of that? Hi y'all, this is Trin. So this is a story I heard from like indigenous folks, because they have a very different way of life than like the US, right? And where we live in the US. But there's an example of how there was a fight between two men, and one killed the other, and the one who was murdered had a family, right? So what happened in this indigenous community is this person got a talking from the elders. This person got a talking from the family and the community most directly impacted by. And then there was a conversation about like how to potentially correct that harm. And so then for the rest of his life, he had to send a check to that family every month because that man had been he doesn't live anymore, right? So this person who then went to the United States had to send money back to his own family of the murdered, right? And I think about like how hard that must be to be that wife or that partner, to be receiving a check from this person who killed their partner, right? And at the same time, how the we is more important than the I, and that for this community. And I think so I'm still like grappling with that story, like how does that work? But I also like what Ana Laura had shared, like, the person harmed and the person who did the harm have to be willing to talk. And also there's a really there's a really real human element to it, right? That, it's hard. It's really hard work.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example. I'm trying to like look through my bookmarks and Beyond Survival on my phone, but I can't find it. But they talked about consequences versus what's a punishment. I can't remember the two phrases, but the idea of like consequences are natural, and like that is not antithetical to transformative justice. Like there is a process, right? I think the defining factor is the consequences. Are they carceral? Are they saying like you are bad and you'll never be good, right? Like, and I think that is the piece for me of like, I think something that gets lost, and it's not just this like happy-go-lucky fairy tale world where someone says sorry and that's the end. Like sometimes the consequences in the TJ process does, like, it is something that is big, right? But it's not something that is throwing someone away. And I think that's the difference.
Exactly. Yeah, because that person didn't go to jail, right, in that community, right? And that person wasn't cast aside. They were still a part of that community, even though they committed a huge harm. So I think back to that a lot.
Yeah. And I think it just highlights how, like, with transformative justice, like, we have to be committed to it through like the long process, like, and acknowledging, like, I've heard of different case studies where like some of them are very simple in terms of like being addressed within a few months, but there's also cases of transformative justice where it takes years, and being okay with like no closure for that many years. It really just, I can't stress, and I know I just saw on the chat, like the process of consent is just so key in this, and relationship building as well.
Great. Thank you both for that. I think we're only going to have time for one more question, and I wanted to be sure to end with this one because I love it. So it's a question from Ben Mendoza, and they ask, with so much happening in the world and how messy transformative justice can be, what keeps you motivated to keep doing this work?
That's such a good question, Ben. Thank you. I think what motivates me are my compas, right? So that includes like Kelsey, Candy, Tren, Kari, folks who do this work. Because it's one of those things where it's like, yes, we have this human feeling of, especially because I'm an Aries too, but I'm also a Cancer moon, so I'm also a crybaby. But what really grounds me and commits me to this work is like firm believing that, like the Zapatistas say, like, otro mundo es posible. Another world is possible. And at the end of the day, like we all we got, right? The name that Christina and Candy shared. And none of us are disposable. And I'm getting chills. So that's one thing that grounds me. I'm not disposable. None of y'all are disposable. Like this shit is hard, but I'm committed because I firmly believe that our communities, all of us need a different world, not tomorrow, but today and yesterday, right? We've been wanting this. So that's one thing that really grounds me and really like guides my commitment.
Yeah, I think similar to that, it's just a knowing of like, there are things like another world is possible, and that like we have the things within us. And also there's this like, you know, I talk about grace, like knowing that transformation is possible because I know my story. Like I know my journey in which that I have, if people knew me in 2010 and some of the beliefs that I held, I'd be canceled. Like, you know, like I think about that. I think about the ways in which I have been given room to grow into who I've been. And I think about the ways in which I could be cutting off other people's growth. And even if I don't have to be around them, like I want to believe that people can not be garbage fires. And I want to like work on honing my skills. And so I'm not doing that work that wasn't done to me, or I'm not recreating that work that was done to me, right? And I think that is where I root myself in, and I find inspiration every day in seeing people who are showing up despite the garbage around them, and are believing that things could be done differently. And that's really where I root myself in, and like one of my core values, love and like belief. And so it gets activated every day.
Thank you, Kelsey. I also want to add, like, it's so easy for me to say this, right? But I also want to be transparent, like practicing it on a day-to-day level. Like it's challenging for me, right? Even though I'm grounding myself on TJ, like it's really challenging. Like I told you, I give you an example of like even this morning with like a work partner and just going through those feelings. So on my end, I just want to acknowledge that as we do this work, we also have to be graceful and practice forgiveness for ourselves. Like we're all flawed human beings, and we're not going to show up a perfect 100% of the time. I think it's one of those things where like I show up in spaces and I know I could have done better. Like I reflect on it, I sit on it, I don't dwell on it. But on my end, I'm able to reflect, how can I show up better or differently next time? So I also just want to like put it out there, like we're not going to get it right all the time.
Thank you so much for that. I know, Ana Laura, you were like, oh, I'm getting chills as you're speaking, but I think we all definitely did as well. I really appreciate both of your time and you sharing all this great information and knowledge with us. I know we're about to run out of time, and so Stacy, one of the political ed committee members, will be taking over the final section, but thank you both so much again. And I have a list of all the questions that were asked in the chat for us to share with all the folks at the end.
And then Jasmine, if you may, I just want to offer, because I really, really like recommend Beyond Survival. But I just want to offer a few lines that were written by Alexis Pauline Gumbs, this amazing Black woman feminist poet. But I just want to offer just a few lines before Stacey takes it away for us. But she writes in the preface, be here, be all over the place, be messy, be wrong, be bold in your hopefulness, be confused in community, be reaching past isolation, be part of the problem, be hungry for after, be helpful in the midst, be so early in the process, be broken by belief, be bolstered by brave comrades, be unbelievably unready, be alive. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Oh, I'm gonna try not to cry right now. Thanks, Ana Laura and Kelsey. And thank you all so much for being here and joining us and holding this space with us. We're so appreciative of everyone's time that you've taken out of your day to be here with us. We're gonna take a quick screenshot of everyone here. So if you don't want to be on the screenshot, totally okay. Feel free to turn off your cameras. And I'll just give everyone a second before taking the screenshot. Make sure I get everybody in there. All right, here we go. Okay, oh wait, hold on. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Awesome. Thank you guys again so much. Our next social solidarity event will be September the 2nd at 12 p.m. Pacific time. We'll be discussing personal accountability and conducting a pod mapping workshop. So all of the really great things that the speakers mentioned and talked about, we'll actually be doing it in practice. We'll be using the model of Mia Mingus and the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, and we'll be exploring the importance of being in relationship and holding ourselves and each other accountable. So thank you again, everyone. If you want to, please follow We All We Got. They're on Instagram at We All We Got SD. Feel free to donate and give your love monetarily and figuratively to them by going to their website. And have a lovely afternoon, and thank you all again.
Bye, y'all. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
For the other folks, are we debriefing? Oh, we're still live. Just kidding.
I'm done. Soul's been saying hi to you over and over, but he couldn't hear you.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thanks, Ian.
¿Cómo estás, Sol? Hola, Sol. So I've been on several calls with Candy, and every time I'm on, Sol hears my voice, and he's like, ¿Cómo estás? And it's like the cutest thing ever.
Alex, I was gonna say that when you logged on, I was about to tear up because I hadn't seen you in so long. I was just like, the tears were gonna come. So I'm so happy to see you.
Yeah, I'm so happy to see you too. Oh, sorry. The reason I'm like speaking quietly because like I think someone else might be on their call, so that's why I'm like always doing this. But I'm so glad to see you as well. You know, let me move to yeah. And I hope for Ana and Kelsey, I hope that I wasn't trying to like. I'm very invested in transformative justice. It's more just like sometimes those are the questions that come across my mind when like I'm just like, and I don't want to. I believe in prison abolition and like abolishing the police, but